Hello, everyone. Very nice to see you. Very nice for me personally to be here. I spent a number of years traveling across the north and working in the north earlier in my career. It's a place that I've always been interested in. It's a place that I think probably left a bigger mark on me as a person and as a journalist than many of the other places that I've been to. And I have to tell you, it's such a great thrill to be with other folks who not only know where Pond Inlet is on a map, but compare its relative beauty with other parts of the Canadian North. So it's brilliant to be here and brilliant to be in this company. I'm not going to repeat elements of the introduction, but it is worth pointing out that Mead is one of the kind of people who has both briefed Mike Pompeo and Hillary Clinton and hired Jean Chrétien. He may or may not be the person responsible for suggesting to China that it could think of itself as a near-Arctic power. He may or may not be able to confirm that this is true. Luke Coffey was with Liam Fox when he paid a visit to Svalbard, which was a visit the Russians, I believe, welcomed with open arms, if I have that correct.
Issued a formal complaint to the Norwegian government.
Open arms, open arms. And the UK, for anyone who needs a geographic refresher, is the most Arctic adjacent country that is not formally an Arctic power.
The true near Arctic.
The true near Arctic. Let the arm wrestling begin. Those of you returning tomorrow will see some familiar faces on the schedule. Us. We're all back tomorrow morning, but fear not, we will endeavor to not repeat tomorrow. There's a great deal to talk about, enough to fill days of panels, but more importantly, we're hoping to do things slightly differently tonight and tomorrow. Tonight we want to talk about the international dimensions of changing Arctic and the ways, in particular, the changing administration in the US is changing things when it comes to the Arctic. We're going to talk about China and Russia, Northern Europe, this little place in between called Greenland, and what that all means. Interesting, both Luke and Mead, I suppose not in this room all that unusual, but you've both been to Greenland. Luke was there, you said 2 weeks before Donald Trump first talked about taking possession of Greenland a few years ago. Mead has the kind of deep relationships in Greenland that lead to his email box pinging with people searching for advice on how they should respond to a president who seems intent on annexing their territory. So maybe we should start there. And Mead, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what happened in between Luke's first visit and now, because for many Americans, Greenland kind of fell off the agenda, but a lot happened. USAID sort of established an office there. There's been a number of different things that have been taking place with regard to U.S. interest in Greenland that extend beyond somebody's musing in the White House. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, here we are at an Arctic conference where we're talking about Arctic policy out in the open. I first worked on Arctic policy when we had only a secret Arctic policy in the United States. And when that was at the end of the first Bush, early Clinton administrations. And later on in the second Bush administration, we had three things that kind of held up a U.S. Arctic policy. One was to mention the words law of the sea, which were kind of a third rail for conservatives in the United States. One was to mention icebreakers, which was a third rail for our budgeteers who didn't want to pay for any of them. And the third was Greenland. And I think even then, as we were working on that policy, we understood that the people of Greenland were looking for self-determination, had come up with terms with Denmark, which I hope I describe artfully as essentially that Greenland could become a fully self-governing state if it could replace the revenues that it's receiving from Copenhagen. And I think that was, and then what happened after that, and it was really before your trip, there was a question of how to finance the airport at Duke. And I was at a conference, and sitting next to me was somebody who managed $260 billion, and he said, maybe at the next stage. I said I'm in private equity, so we invest in companies, not necessarily in that kind of infrastructure. One of the Danish national banks said this is probably more appropriate for our transportation ministry than it is for us as investors. And the guy at the end of the table was the Chinese Investment Corporation. He said, yeah, we'll invest. And I think what happened there was when Donald Trump first talked about it, the question was, well, who should really be investing in that kind of infrastructure? And as a result, Denmark stepped much higher up in terms of its investment. The United States opened up a consulate. We also opened up a USAID office that was to assist in development. We weren't necessarily providing, foreign aid to a territory of a certainly well-off economic nation. And I think it has been since that time where we couldn't mention Greenland because we weren't trying to get involved in essentially a domestic issue, but we just know that for all of ourselves, if we're going to have an Arctic that works together, we have to be friends with the people of Greenland. This does not mean that you're not friends with Denmark. It means that we're working together to build the alliance, building investment. And now what's happening, and one of my companies, which was mentioned, PT Capital, is working to help the government of Greenland finance new cruise ship ports, new hotels. Tourism is expected to be one of the major growth industries there besides mining. And I think it's really incumbent on all of us to do what we can to help this area of the world be prosperous.
Do you see this current administration's focus on Greenland as helpful or hurtful to Alaska's interests?
My friend Dan Sullivan, our senator, has said, for everything that the president says he wants with Greenland, he can get with Alaska. I'll say this, having been an advocate for missile defense and Canada having not been part of missile defense, and Aaron and I were talking about that at dinner, the fact that you've got the radars at Thule are incredibly important, not just to the defense of North America, but to the defense of Europe. And we have radars in Shemya, looking way out in the Pacific. We've got in the Aleutians, we've got radars at Clear. We have the interceptors for all of North America, primarily at Fort Greely. And frankly, with the missile threat growing, hypersonics growing, not only do we have to be more joined at the hip with our NATO allies, but I'd actually hope that Canada might come in more solidly than it has. So the issues that you're hearing about with Greenland really tie much more into Pan-Arctic security than the papers are making out of it.
You can never believe the newspapers.
They just say you don't have a large enough news hole to tell the whole story.
Luke, tell us your understanding of what this incoming administration wants with Greenland, and to what degree do you see this as being driven by commercial interests?
Right. Well, firstly, I want to thank Arctic 360 for inviting me to speak, and thanks, Nathan, for moderating this panel. Look, when it comes to the Trump administration in Greenland and then the business aspects of it, I don't know honestly, I'm not sure how much of it is that. I don't know if it's really focused on the economics and the business side of things. I mean, for the obvious reason that there's very little economic relationship between the U.S. and Greenland, or even North America and Greenland. It'll be starting in June. There'll be the first direct flight from North America to Greenland since the 1990s. There's going to be a United Airlines seasonal flight over the summer to Greenland. I think there's huge potential there. But I think a lot of this is driven more by geopolitics and China and Russia. Often, Trump himself frames the debate around China and Russia. His surrogates go on television and talk about minerals and everything else. But with Trump himself, it's very much the geopolitics of it. I'll say, since the Danish ambassador is here, Denmark is an important ally of the United States. And most Americans that are aware of Denmark's role inside NATO are truly appreciative. Personally, I've seen Danish soldiers in action from Nuuk in Greenland to Not Ali in Helmand Province in Afghanistan. And I recognize, and I think many of my colleagues also recognize the importance of Denmark. I believe that in the Arctic region, sovereignty equals stability. And that means respecting the sovereignty of others while also having the ability to enforce and protect your own sovereignty. So the question we have to ask as Americans, can we achieve our geopolitical intent with the arrangement we have now with Greenland and Denmark? Do we need to modify it or change it? And if so, how? On the extreme, this could mean, as Trump says, not ruling out the use of military force. But in reality, it's more likely going to be perhaps new agreements, something probably to do with the base maintenance contract, the shipping contracts, maybe expanding Thule in some capacity, maybe some sort of agreement about minerals and energy. And I think ultimately this is where President Trump is going. We know from the first term, he loves to start way up here, knowing that he's probably going to end somewhere here. And I think that's probably what we're going to see. And also I think there's a Greenlandic dimension to this where I think they would like to maybe revisit some of these seemingly bilateral or at least trilateral agreements between Greenland, Denmark, and the United States, and for them to have more of a say or a bigger stamp on these agreements. So I think there's opportunity from Nuuk to to facilitate some of this discussion. But let's be honest, not ruling out the use of military force, saying that the people, the locals are unhappy, it's in our backyard, it's crucial to our national security. What does that sound like? It sounds like how Russians talk about Crimea, right? So I think we have to separate some of the rhetoric and look at some of the policy outcomes, and hopefully I think we will see a sensible approach to how we enhance our relationship and our engagement with Greenland and how this impacts Denmark. But right now it seems very bumpy.
How do you understand that not ruling out military force? Like when you hear that, what do you hear?
I think that what that means is that if a Chinese icebreaker shows up near Thule, we will help defend Thule. I don't think it means that we would have any military action, at least nothing stronger than, say, the military action between Canada and Denmark over Banks Island, which might be leaving a bottle of scotch or schnapps.
Well, that's my solution. Give Trump Hans Island. He gets a piece of Canada, a piece of Denmark, and then it's all sorted.
No, I agree with I agree with you there. The fact is, here's one thing that is also a question that comes to me from Greenland. All right. If we were to associate with the United States, how would we do that? Would we be like Puerto Rico as a commonwealth? Would it be a protectorate of sorts like the Marshall Islands? Would we be like the Marianas or something along those lines? And the question is, nobody knows. Okay, so would it be the 51st state? Would it merge with Alaska? Those are all kinds of questions that you want to look at. The second thing that I'll just say is that for a northern economy, and if you look at Alaska in a federal system, we are battered around by federal legislation that we might be in the middle of building a road, and all of a sudden Joe Biden will say, no, we have to redo the environmental issue. We feel very, very little self-control. And to the extent that the Greenlanders have strong support for self-determination, you better find a better relationship with the United States than we have, or I wouldn't recommend it.
Well, this is one of the questions that I've had, which is, what's the pitch to Greenland? I mean, what's the pitch that would sort of make sense for Greenland to having some sort of different relationship with the United States? I mean, if Puerto Rico's not a great model, if not even Alaska is is necessarily the most attractive model. Where's the pitch?
Well, again, if you, I think I'll go back to this trilateral discussion that happens every year. For a long time, it wasn't happening very well. And later in this conference, I'm sure you'll hear from people who've been involved in it. And it could be, just, look at a couple of things. In terms of cash flow between the United States and Greenland, North America and Greenland, we spend a lot of money at the base, but we don't pay rent on the base. It's Denmark's contribution, as I understand it, through NATO. We had the glitch on shipping a few years ago, and all of a sudden Royal Greenland Line had to double the cost of milk from others along their route because we weren't shipping American military goods, and we fixed that back. We buy a lot of fish. We buy a lot of science. The NSF has complained to me that their scientists are now paying income tax in Greenland, and I said, well, if you're working in a country, you probably have to pay income tax many other places too. So what's the problem? But there are opportunities. I mean, Greenland would like to have investments that work in its mining. They would like to have investments that work in its tourism. For beefing up the defense budgets, when I talked about missile defense, the missile threat is changing. The fact that and it's not drones in New Jersey I'm talking about the ability of drones or cruise missiles to come in to our sovereign territory through the north without detection. We are not upgrading the radars fast enough. We do not have overhead radars fast enough. You could take off with your grandfather's Bear bomber in a nadir and open up your cruise missiles at about 200 feet, and we wouldn't even see them necessarily coming until they'd hit our radars. There is a very significant new, when the president talks about the Iron Dome for North America, that will be a significant investment in Greenland, in Canada, in Alaska, to make sure that our continent is well protected. And frankly, the dual role that Thule has for also defending Europe, it will probably significantly involve Europe as well. So expect serious discussions to everything that you've said on finance. And I thought you were the security guy. I was going to just add a little bit, but expect very serious discussions on security that will mean greater investment. And as I say, it's not just going to be US, Greenland, Denmark talking. It's going to be Europe. It's going to be Canada talking together.
Luke, can you talk about that? Because, from one perspective, there's been some discussion, for example, about some of the shipping channels around Greenland opening up and that constituting a sort of a vulnerability. But you can send a ship past Greenland. That's an awful long way from New York. You can look at that and say, how could this possibly be seen as a vulnerability for the United States?
First, I'll say, being in Canada, wait until Donald Trump learns about the Northwest Passage.
He was talking about it the other day. Now, come on.
He'll take out the map, and then he'll be drawing with a Sharpie. With Greenland in this context of regional security, Mead is absolutely right. For reasons of physics, geometry, and geography, Greenland is a major forward operating base of the North American continent, along with Iceland. And then I would say the patrol bases of the North American continent are Jan Mayen Island and then Svalbard, but that's more complicated with the demilitarized nature of the islands, but nevertheless, important piece of real estate. And one thing that President Trump is doing is at least showing an acknowledgement that Greenland is important to the United States security and also, by extension, Canada's security. And this is a positive thing. And I think we will get an outcome where the U.S. and Greenland will have a closer relationship. I don't think it'll be a model of it. I don't think it'll be a state or a territory. Honestly, I'm a strong believer in self-determination, and perhaps this is more of an old-fashioned concept. But if the Greenlandic people declare independence and then choose they want to be American, then we can have this discussion. But I don't think this is something that should be sort of forced upon them. And I do believe that we can achieve our geopolitical goals by enhancing the current arrangement that we have. And I think sometimes right now it works. Thule works very well for the United States. Huge benefits for the U.S. operating out of Thule. The basing contracts, the shipping contracts are also, let's be honest, tilted in favor of the United States. We have been able to, if not the U.S. directly, but at least indirectly working with Copenhagen and Nuuk, been able to prevent any serious Chinese investment and involvement in Greenland. So that works. The big concern that we have, that works. I mean, honestly, the first time I went to Greenland, when you read American press, you think you're going to need a Mandarin phrase book. I went there, I didn't knowingly see a single Chinese person. So
You
I think
only need that if you go through the Panama Canal to get there.
Yeah. Had I gone through, I mean, in that context, Iceland might be a bigger concern, I dare say. I think we should try to take advantage of at least this new focus on Greenland, try to leverage what President Trump and those around him are doing to highlight the importance of Greenland. And then I think as things move forward, we'll take a more reasonable approach to how we deepen that important relationship.
So if I can, just to draw upon the Sharpie and the Northwest Passage. I've spent a lot of time traveling around the world proposing that the allies in the Arctic work on an Arctic Seaway. And if I have any one appeal tonight, is that the United States and Canada, in thinking about how we want to work together in the Arctic, we have huge experience with developing a joint seaway in the St. Lawrence. We have ports, Albert Barbucci is here with Novaport, that literally is at the gateway to both the Northwest Passage and the St. Lawrence. We have ports coming in Alaska. I'm working on one obviously for export of LNG, but the US and Canadian ports work together, the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes together this. We need to be thinking about this. Yeah. We have a three-way agreement between Finland, Canada, and the United States on icebreakers. There is a piece of law that I passed right before I passed. I helped write it, Congress passed it, that creates an advisory committee to the federal agencies to figure out how we should set up an Arctic Seaway. And Joe Biden did not appoint anybody to it. I think this president will. And what's very, very interesting about this is there will be an opportunity for us to talk about icebreakers, to talk about ports, to talk about shipping that will include the issues around Greenland. It will include the issues, and it's not going to be the old kind of think tank sovereignty fight between the United States and Canada over who controls this. The question is, how do we have Arctic shipping to be safe, and how do we have a Arctic presence that is safe? And I think that's where we're coming, and how do we foster the right kind of investments into the Arctic? Because we don't want Russia and China controlling shipping services in the Arctic. Let me say that again. They have an agreement right now. I have a major LNG tanker passing by Alaska through the Bering Strait. The military calls it the Bering Gate, about one a day, year-round through the ice. And all ice, anybody in Korea, Japan, China, Singapore who wants to use the Arctic Ocean to travel to Europe or to bring goods to Eastern North America basically has to pay for Russian ship services, because we've never sat down. In the last administration, they didn't want to talk about shipping. We need to talk about it together. And so I think we're seeing a change in the wind on security, which is very positive and about time. We're going to see a change in discussion about shipping. And we're seeing a massive change, as you may have this as another question, coming on energy. And we can talk about that.
To what degree are you concerned that sort of better shipping through the Canadian North, through the Northwest Passage, it benefits China above others? It benefits the commercial interests of China in terms of the efficiency of their trade above other players.
So I testified for U.S. icebreakers for a long time, and one of the reasons for a seaway is because I'd like to see a fee-based system, so it's not our taxpayers paying so that China can sell goods more efficiently to Europe. We have the third or fourth largest air cargo port in the world in Anchorage. It's Chinese air traffic, Korean air traffic, Japanese air traffic, Taiwanese air traffic. Those airplanes even park right next to each other. And the fact is that the North is central to global shipping. It's central to global telecommunications. It's central to global aviation. And if you're looking for sustainable ways to develop industry and jobs in the North, pay attention to transportation. But make sure that the customer pays the bill. That's what we're saying. Canada, you know, if you're driving the North, if you're a boat from Germany going to pick up ore in Duluth for a German steel mill, you will use the St. Lawrence, and if they send a Canadian icebreaker, they'll send you a bill. If they send an American icebreaker, they assume you've paid the port taxes in Duluth. And the U.S. Coast Guard has a difference in philosophy than the Canadian Coast Guard, which is we don't charge for search and rescue because then people won't call us and people will die, is what the Commandant has said to me. But either way, both our Coast Guards would much rather that there be a salvage company out there or somebody else, and getting a ship services regime established like the Russians have makes a whole lot of sense for our presence in the Arctic, for answering the questions that are asked in Canada. I remember a Senate hearing on this issue in Canada of what are we doing to actually have our presence in the Arctic, because if we don't have it, nature abhors a vacuum.
What's your sense? You talked about this, about this kind of the secret Arctic policy in the White House. You know, the inability to get George Bush to so much as say the word icebreaker. To what degree is this administration different in terms of the expertise, not just the interest, because we've seen obviously President Trump express some interest in Greenland, but in terms of the expertise it brings to bear on the Arctic? Are you seeing sort of different people who are in positions that can actually sort of affect some more change in some of these areas?
You know, honestly, I think it's the Arctic adjacent issues that are going to be driving Arctic policy in the White House. It's not going to be having an Arctic strategy for the sake of the region. It's going to be having an Arctic strategy because of what Russia might be doing, what China might be doing, some of the energy components of this. I think this is what's going to be driving it. I mean, also this is a reminder of how important institutional relationships are between governments. We often get caught up on like the political rhetoric. What's the prime minister saying? What's the president saying? What are members of Congress saying? What are members of parliament saying? But at the end of the day, driving the train, continuing on, despite the political noise, are the officials. And if there is a new DoD Arctic strategy, which the last one was published last July, but if there is a new one, it will be driven by, I think, the officials, not any political guidance coming from the White House. Same with State Department. But when there's an opportunity to raise issues that are Arctic adjacent, like China, like Russia, then I think they will take advantage of that, and they will do that.
Let me give you a few specifics. Dan Sullivan, our senator, is on the Armed Services Committee, chairs the Coast Guard Committee. I think he's got a much stronger platform than he had 2 months ago. Yeah. He is very, very interested. He gave a talk at your institute at Hudson, yep, where he was calling for a new Navy base at Adak. Now, what's the case for a base way out in the Aleutians? We had one. We closed it before we closed the base at Keflavik, and both of them were sub-chasers. I think we've realized now that we've got lots better queuing with fiber optic lines. We've got much better opportunities there at a need. When the Chinese and the Russians are together doing live fire exercises in the Bering Sea, it's important to have that presence. So I think you'll have that, both for the missile defense strategic issues, but also because, it's if you haven't heard the idea of the first island chain, second island chain, third island chain, the first island chain in any sort of outbreak of war over Taiwan is right there in the Pacific with names that we got very familiar with in World War II. The third island chain is any sort of resupply for us to help Japan, for us to help Korea, for us to help Taiwan is coming through Alaska. And so that makes us an immediate target. So protecting those seaways is incredibly important. So you're likely to see that, and Asia may well be the driver in this part of the Arctic region than the Arctic itself. On the shipping issues, to go back to your question about people, what's happened literally since Donald Trump took office a while ago, the first time, is that in the Biden administration, we established the the Arctic Security Study Center, and Craig Fleener will be here at this conference and can talk about that. Dan Sullivan has been, he would be proud of me calling him a pest to every one of the armed services to get them to write an Arctic strategy and then to come test it. And when we were working on railroad connections between Alaska and Canada, I had an Air Force general say to me, the best thing he ever did in the Air Force is an exercise which failed for lack of logistics support, which is why we ended up getting a port in the South Persian Gulf. The fact is that in any defense of the Arctic, we've got awful logistics right now, and that's something that our services will be working on quite a bit. So I think there's going to be, it's going to be drivers at DOD. We have an Arctic ambassador who may or may not be replaced at state. We've got people at the National Security Council who are very, very well versed on Arctic issues. And you have a president who's not afraid to look at the opportunities. I mean, literally, we could not get Bush to, those words got crossed out. Obama came up and said we need an icebreaker at the end of his 8-year term. Trump, in his first speech to the National Guard, to the Coast Guard Academy, said we need 9. And last week he said we need 40. Okay? I'm just hoping we can get 2, but we're working on it.
No, I want to follow up on a very important point that Mead just made about the constitutional role of the U.S. legislative branch in making or at least editing U.S. foreign policy. In most parliamentary democracies, especially in Europe, foreign policy is the sole prerogative of the executive branch. In the U.S. Constitution, it is led by the executive branch as well. However, the U.S. Congress has appropriations and authorizations authorities that allow them to be very influential. And when I was saying that a lot of U.S. Arctic strategy and policy will be driven by officials, I should have also included people like Dan Sullivan, people in the Hill, where a lot of this will be also driven from Congress. And Congress, through its acts of appropriation and authorization of federal spending, can have a big say and influence on a U.S. Arctic policy.
And to that end, you'll hear on Thursday from Senator Murkowski. And Senator Murkowski has been the most active of American Arctic parliamentarians. She is the second or third ranking Republican on, actually Mitch McConnell just aced her out as the second, on the Appropriations Committee. She oversees the defense construction budget. I think you're going to see that 2 senators from Alaska alone, as well as people like Senator King from Maine and others, want to see the kind of investment in the Arctic that we've been talking about.
I was going to ask you something which you've already just partially answered, but to what degree do you see Alaska as sort of both influential or as a driving force in terms of some of this Arctic policy?
So we try to be influential, and I think we're very influential on getting us to think about the security issues right now. The energy issues, the president, no other state got its own giant executive order early on in the Trump administration. And executive orders, when you read them, are like letters of intent. They ask agencies to go do something. They don't necessarily mean that they're going to happen. But we are getting a lot of attention there. The Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Interior is going to head the energy effort. Well, and this is the thing. Energy policy, climate policy, environmental policy, other kinds of environmental policy have really been kind of apart in recent years. It's been, you might find Justin Trudeau and Barack Obama agreeing that there's going to be no more drilling in the Arctic, and the governor of Alaska might find out about the next day. I think we've got enough lines of communication that except maybe for renaming a mountain, we'll get the consultation that we're looking for. And that's very, very important.
Do you think, as the once again home to Mount McKinley, you have a claim to a greater share of the tariffs that will be raised in the new McKinley regime?
No comment.
A harder sort of security type question. How much has the war in Ukraine altered some of the considerations in the Arctic? How much has it altered, for example, Russia's ability to be an operational force in the Arctic?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there have been many consequences, second or third order effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the Arctic is not exempt from this. Just off the top of my head, it led to one of the most important enlargements of NATO in decades, in my opinion, with Finland and Sweden finally joining, meaning that the Arctic 7 are now all under the same security umbrella. It has meant that, like for China, it's been a double-edged sword. On one hand, because the Arctic Council has essentially stopped functioning in any meaningful way, China has lost that platform that it really liked to use to promote its vision and its agenda on the international stage about the Arctic. But on the other hand, the relationship between, as Mead was pointing out, with the shipping agreements and the LNG, the cooperation between China and Russia in the Arctic has never been closer. And China knows that Russia is the junior partner now in a lot of these agreements and this engagement. And then you have, from a military point of view, you have, maybe it was a coincidence that Hans Island was settled after Russia invaded Ukraine and later in 2022. You had Russian military units that were specially trained and equipped at great expense to operate in high north environments, used as cannon fodder in many places in eastern Ukraine. And the levels of readiness of Russian Arctic forces is probably at an all-time low. And then I would say NATO has become more aware of the role it should have institutionally in the region. Before the strategic concept was published in 2022, the summer of 2022, which the strategic concept for NATO is the document that's meant to guide the alliance going into the future on what the threats are, where the important regions are. Before June of 2022, you could not find the word Arctic mentioned in any official NATO document. It literally did not exist. You opened up a communique, a summit declaration, a strategic concept in PDF, hit Control F, type in the word Arctic, it did not exist. There are reasons for this we could get into. Part of it had to do with a different point of view between Norway and Canada. But nevertheless, that has changed in the strategic concept of June of 2022. There was mention of the high north. In the summit communique the following year in 2023, you had an explicit mention of the Arctic and what Russia's doing in the region. And then at the last NATO summit, you had another mention of the high north. So I think perhaps Russia's invasion of Ukraine has also refocused the alliance on its raison d'etre of territorial defense. And that means you have to be able to defend Tromsø in the same way you might have to defend Tallahassee.
I'm going to say the effect of Ukraine war has had, you say, secondary and tertiary effects. First off, any war that has thrown as many cruise missiles as we've seen is a very sad but dangerous training ground for its use other places. And we've seen that we're not yet very good at defending there. The Iranians also tested Israel on this, and we're using fighter jets to shoot down cruise missiles, and we don't yet have a good solution. So I don't mean to be a broken record, but I think we've learned, and I think the Russians have learned, and I think the Chinese have learned, and I think the Iranians have learned that they've got a tool that is somewhat it's essentially a big drone. So we've got problems there. I think a second thing that's important for us to think about in the NATO alliance is that Finland has been hurt maybe more than any of the other Arctic countries in terms of the Ukraine war, in that Finland is, always was kind of the cheapest place for tourists from Asia to land in Europe, and overflights over Russia are not happening anymore. Finland had a big shipbuilding industry that was building a lot of ships for the Russians. That's not happening anymore. And so I think we should pay attention to that part of our alliance. It's pretty important. And we had an investment in Finland that, frankly, because tourism went down, it was one of our tougher ones. Finally, I'm going to say that even though the rhetoric has changed on energy and climate, the issues have not changed in terms of what do we do scientifically, what do we know scientifically. And we are not getting anywhere near the kind of data that we were getting out of Russia before the war. We are holding back our fisheries. We are seeing the Russians cheat dramatically on fisheries. We're seeing the Russians catch far more than the pollock they've told us that they were going to catch, and unloading it in Chinese markets and in Japanese markets. And I don't want to sound like an international neoconservative who believes in the world order, but the world order, frankly, was that we could kind of rely on our partners to help protect the oceans. The world order kind of said that we would talk together in a free trade environment and try to help build investment. And the lack of that consensus that, frankly, came with Crimea and Ukraine has been very, very destructive to very productive work that we had going on in the Arctic since 1990. And even discussions on shipping. So I'll just say it's going to take it's going to take decades for rebuilding of trust with the Russians. If you did get a ceasefire that worked, there will be early science agreements. There will be early other things, but we're essentially dealing with a kleptocracy that is just absurd.
On China and Russia and military partnership, we've seen Chinese and Russian jets flying together in the high latitudes. We've seen their ships sailing together in the high latitudes. How do you read that? And where do you see this as heading? Are these, these are training exercises towards something. What is this telling us in terms of this partnership between China and Russia, this military partnership in the Arctic?
We're doing it we're doing it between Taiwan and China right now. So I think there's a little bit of a tit for tat. If you can do it there, we can do it here. But it is possible to have miscalculations that cause people to die. That's very sad. We don't want to have that happen. We've had fishermen who had to pull out their nets quickly. I mean, these were big fishing boats because they were live fire exercises, and Russians flying around with loudspeakers saying, "We're about to fire missiles here, get out of here."
These are Alaska fishermen.
Yeah. We've had things that just don't work in any sense of international order happening there, and that's very dangerous. But the more familiarity that people have with an area, the easier it is to think about what it does. And I think about our vulnerabilities all the time whenever I'm working with our defense agencies and our homeland security agencies, and they're testing our vulnerabilities as we speak.
I would just add to that there is this growing dynamic that Russia is that dependent junior partner. And while it is also a reminder that the security of East Asia is, I would say, now linked to the security of Eastern Europe. And those who try to differentiate the two or say, well, we only need to focus on one, we don't need to focus on other, need to roll out a map and see how, I mean, in a geographical sense, it is connected. In a geopolitical sense, it's getting more connected than ever before. But also there is, I think, an element of tit for tat, and we're doing this because we can. And I do wonder, what is, there's a big difference flying a fighter jet near Alaska. And then what we haven't seen is very large scale maritime maneuvers or air maneuvers or like large scale reinforcement of Chinese troops working with Russia. in the Arctic. But I think we're trending in that direction.
I'll just tell you a story. In 2011, I was invited to the Russian Geographic Society's annual Arctic meeting hosted by a guy named Vladimir Putin in Archangel.
Sounds familiar. Where have I heard that name before?
It's a KGB guy, right?
And they said, Governor, would you mind co-chairing a panel? And I said, sure. And I ended up looking at the agenda, and it was 3 hours one afternoon and 3 hours the next morning. And it was Putin's entire cabinet, every agency in the government, justifying their expenditures in the Arctic and using the security edge. And there were a lot of Westerners there. There were a lot of Europeans there. But I don't believe everything I read whenever I look at these maps of all these Russian things built up. I've talked to fighter pilots and say, well, I've been at Cape Schmidt. I've been at Nadir. Have you been? But most of those jets on the ground haven't flown in 25 years. But I think the point is this: take a look at our choke points. The Arctic Ocean is a resupply route. It's already a resupply route for our submarines. Anybody who can block the Bering Strait and has that capability to make that lessens our capability in defending order in Asia. Likewise in the Aleutians. Likewise in the Northwest Passage. Likewise in defending Thule. And if we don't look at what those threats are and appropriately prepare for them, it's our own damn fault.
We're going to go to questions. So if you have one, get ready. I just have one last one. I mean, institutions like the Arctic Council, some of these, they were all designed to have sort of a more cooperative approach to the Arctic. To what degree do you see that as being at risk of moving towards sort of greater competition, greater hostility?
I think that, honestly, I've written this, I've proposed this in some of my papers. I think we, at least for the time being, we need to establish a new institution, even if it's informal, and we need to focus on the Arctic 7. The idea that we're ever going to return back to our relationship with Russia anytime soon, and I mean within a generation, I think is naive, to be honest. Yes, I know Russia has half of the world's Arctic coastline, and Russia is, of course, a major Arctic power. But we have to find ways to continue with scientific progress, energy cooperation, environmental cooperation, and we just cannot let institutional parliamentary procedure inside the Arctic Council block or stop this. And on the note of the Arctic Council, one potential minefield or pitfall I could see on the horizon is when Denmark takes over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, and then noises start coming from Greenland that they want a bigger role, they want a seat at that table. And then, the White House hears this, latches onto this, and then they say, well, there's another example of the Greenlanders being marginalized. We want to do more in the Arctic with the Greenlandic government, et cetera, et cetera. So I am against this now yearly drumbeat of NATO summits because I think they don't amount to much, and expectations are always ruined. Before we used to have NATO summits every 2 or 3 years. Now we have them annually. That should stop. And I would advise against I don't know if anything's being cooked up right now with the Danish chairmanship about trying to do something with the Arctic Council, but I would leave it in its current dormant form and maybe try to work with other Arctic countries about doing something in parallel or separate.
Luke, I can say, as having been the lead Arctic guy for a subdivision of the United States, that Denmark has done a much better job of putting its subdivisions, the Faroe Islands and Greenland, forward in Arctic Council meetings. Yeah. I used to sit there as part of a 3-member U.S. delegation, and the U.S. delegation is so big, the state of Alaska is thrown to the back bench. The Obama administration cut the state of Alaska out of Arctic policy planning, and we had to beat the door down other ways. So I'm not too worried about what you were saying there.
No, not in practice, but in this era of,
sure,
hybrid warfare, fake news, and everything else, it wouldn't take much to create a story where there isn't one.
So,
And then that's another division.
I think one other thing that is it's a particularly Canadian invention when the Arctic Council was established. Mary Simon is seen as really the mother of the Arctic Council here, and she was head of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference. And this has become really one of the best ways for Indigenous groups to work together on practical issues in the North, and that should not go away.
Yeah.
And that applies to the Ripon people who still are in contact here. It applies to our requirements on observers that they work with Indigenous groups. There's a lot of good that has happened at the Arctic Council on shipping, on contaminants, on climate, and I think we can be useful. So I'll leave it at that.
Does anyone have a question? Please.
Also, we can barely see with the lights, so we just hear a voice, basically.
Can you just introduce yourself briefly?
Test. Okay. Well, thank you for those words. My name is Danny Saracen. I'm from Algonquin, Pequawknagon First Nation, unceded, unsurrendered territory. And I work for Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, ITK, as a senior policy advisor. And I appreciate your words and what we're doing here. I just wanted to address the lack of Inuit participation in this conversation in this panel.
Sorry, the lack of...
The lack of Inuit participation in this panel. We're talking about Arctic 360, which includes a lot of countries, and we're talking about national defense, but we're talking about commodities and interests that we're not allowed to be part of. So in short of my president, Natan Obed, being here, I just started with Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, working on economic development, working with D&D and some of those files. And we want procurement rates up. We want economic development. But I just hope that what comes out of here today in the next few days is that we're here for Inuit interests. And I don't hear that yet. Okay, my wife is a Nook. I am First Nations, and we want the best for our kids. We want to protect ourselves, but you have to have us included in this conversation. And I don't feel like we're included so far in this conversation. And I'm no disrespect. I respect all of you and what you're saying. And it's, I'll leave it at that.
I think we all agree with you that you can have a conversation about Arctic security, Arctic energy, the environment, the economy, without, of course, factoring in the Indigenous people. That being said, I believe on the website, the title for tonight's panel was Donald Trump and the Arctic. So I think that explains why you have two gringos here talking
But
about...
we're talking about treaties. Nunangat. These treaties are not being implemented yet. And you're talking about authorities over and above our lands. Okay? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Any other questions? Yes.
Aaron.
Thank you very much. And I agree, Indigenous conversations are very, very important, but this was a geopolitical panel where we want some friends up from the United States to whisper the answer on how to deal with President Trump in our ears so that we can take it into wider discussions tomorrow. And we have to recognize that we, the North, should be more than the Raptors slogan. It means every Canadian should be engaged. Inuit, Indigenous, non-Southerners. So I really appreciate this panel. The one thing I want to add and then ask, you both, Mead and Luke, is the question that was asked, what has happened since the war in Ukraine? For Canada, within 30 days, we resolved Hans Island, and we signed on to the North Warning Systems investment,
Yeah.
which we had been asking for many years. But the reality of the full invasion got us to finally pay attention. Now, what will happen if the Trump administration rushes some temporary accord or some sort of resolution? Will that stop a lot of this momentum in the Arctic and NATO now talking about it? Will it sort of put everything into hibernation? Any thoughts on, I think Donald Trump said he would solve it in 24 hours. You know, it's been a few more hours than that.
Yeah,
But
it has.
what happens then to this focus in the Arctic if there's a resolution there? NATO's expanded. A lot of countries are now paying attention. But does this all get sidetracked if that is now kind of resolved in the view of the United States?
On the issue of President Trump and Ukraine, of course, during the campaign, there was a lot of rhetoric. I'll solve this in 24 hours and whatever. But then, you know, since winning re-election, you've seen a dramatic shift in his rhetoric. He said things like, well, this could actually be more difficult than solving Israel and Gaza. Could take, you know, this could be very difficult. It could take months. I think he's given Special Envoy Keith Kellogg 100 days to try to make progress on this. And I think we have to try to figure out where Trump is going with Ukraine, which right now is we're not in a bad spot. Honestly, I thought we'd be in a worse situation than where we are. But we have arms still going to Ukraine. We have a Secretary of State that has said positive things about Ukraine supported funding in the past, who was the co-sponsor of a piece of legislation last year that made it illegal for any president to unilaterally withdraw from NATO. Rubio was the Republican co-sponsor for that legislation. Waltz at the National Security Council has a solid track record on Ukraine. Even Pete Hegseth, who admittedly oozes in controversy, when it comes to the issue of NATO, European security, transatlantic security, Russia, has been fine. I mean, from a European point of view, I see no problems with Pete Hegseth. During his hearing, confirmation hearing, he said, we know who the good guys are, we know who the bad guys are, and we want to get the most advantageous deal for Ukraine. But to have an idea on where Trump is going to go with this, I think you have to look at his first term with the biggest foreign policy issue during his campaign in 2016, and that was JCPOA, leaving the Iran deal. We heard the same thing. I'm leaving this on day one. Horrible deal. Obama giving cash to the mullahs. Terrible deal for America. Terrible for Israel. Day one comes. Everyone, all the hawks, Iran hawks, are waiting for him to leave the deal. Nothing happens. In fact, nothing happened on that until October of 2017, which was the first step of decertifying Iran's compliance to that deal. And then it wasn't until May of 2018 that he left the deal. 1/3 of the way into his first term, he left the Iran deal. And when he left that deal, on day one of leaving it, he instituted the maximum pressure campaign. So you could agree with or disagree with President Trump's decision to leave JCPOA. You could agree with or disagree with his maximum pressure campaign, but nobody can say that this was like a knee-jerk reaction. I know at the time I was at the Heritage Foundation, which of course has very close relations with Trump world, and we were working with the administration at the time on JCPOA, how to leave this bad deal. Frankly, it was a bad deal. How to leave it responsibly and what to do after you leave. I hope that with Ukraine being the biggest foreign policy issue that he is facing, at least during the campaign, this featured prominently. I think we're starting to see the same deliberate approach to how to deal with this problem and not some sort of knee-jerk reaction. Perhaps this is my American optimism showing itself, but I think he understands, and this is the final point I'll make on this, he understands that any outcome that might leave Russia looking like it has the better hand makes him look like a loser. And people in the Trump orbit are frightened of another geopolitical disaster like Afghanistan, because they know deep down it was very close that it was them that made that mistake. Luckily, Biden came in and continued with the deal, and it landed on Biden. And they do not want that same thing to happen. And they know that potentially between Russia and Ukraine, there is a risk of a big geopolitical disaster. So I am hopeful that we are heading in the right direction when it comes to Russia and Ukraine.
But on that question about sort of, there's a lot of attention. If things cool down in terms of sort of the hostilities around Russia, does that divert the attention away from the Arctic? Does that divert sort of the momentum that has been built up?
At our peril, okay? If we're not looking at what we should be doing with telecommunications and making it happen, it's at our peril because we're overly exposed to other places. If we're not looking at what I've said about missile defense, it's at our peril. And if we're still ceding the Arctic Ocean to a Russian-Chinese combine, that's at our peril. So, in that regard, that's there. And to respond to the question, the well-phrased question about the Inuit here too, we have it used to be our biggest Alaska problem between Alaska and Canada was fish in the Yukon River. Now we don't have any. We're trying to how the heck to bring this back. And you want to talk about Alaska natives, Craig Fleener will be here tomorrow. His family, he grew up in Fort Yukon where fishing on the Yukon River was the way you got food. It was either salmon or moose, okay? And we're having a giant problem right now that we don't understand scientifically. We need to address that. And that's a common problem with Canada. And if you want to help protect the lifestyle of that particular group, which is a lot of people who live in Yukon, some people who live BC and NWT, let's work together more effectively on fish. It's real.